Imagine walking into a church in the 1500s expecting to see the usual: holy saints, noble angels, maybe a gentle Virgin Mary. Instead, you're met with visions of grotesque demons sprouting claws, scales, wings and snouts, tearing at a frail old monk. For centuries, this one saint has been painted, engraved, carved and imagined in more terrifying ways than almost any other. Not Christ, not the Virgin, not the martyrs of Rome. It was an old hermit who lived alone in the desert, St. Anthony the Great. The father of monasticism, the first man to retreat fully from the world, to face his demons in solitude. But those demons did not remain metaphorical. Artists across Europe seized on his legendary visions, temptations by lust, despair and monstrous apparitions, and turned them into some of the most shocking, grotesque and surreal images ever produced. This is The Temptation of St. Anthony, a theme in Western art so shocking it blurred the line between sacred devotion and scandalised medieval Europe, and still captivates us today. The story began with St. Anthony the Great, one of the earliest Christian monks, who abandoned society to live in the harsh Egyptian desert during the 3rd century. He wanted purity, a life stripped of earthly distraction, devoted only to God. But legend says the desert gave him anything but peace. Here in the solitude of sand and silence, his faith was tested like no other. Demons descended on him, not once, not twice, but relentlessly. They came in endless disguises. Some tempted him with gold and riches, glittering illusions of wealth he could have claimed. Others appeared as visions of flesh and desire, twisting holiness into lust. Still more attacked with fear and despair, monstrous creatures clawing at his sanity, whispering that God had abandoned him. Night after night, the desert became a battlefield. But Anthony endured and resisted every vision and hallucination. And in doing so, he became a symbol, the man who proved that true faith can stare down hell itself and not flinch. For medieval artists, this legend was pure fuel. It wasn't just a saintly tale of piety, it was a license to unleash the darkest corners of imagination. And so over the centuries, Anthony's quiet desert struggle transformed on canvas into some of the most terrifying, surreal and shocking art Europe had ever seen. Art that didn't shock because of the saint, but because of the demons that surrounded him. The 1470s brought Europe something it had never truly seen before. Its first great wave of artistic terror. At the centre of it was Martin Schongauer, a German engraver whose work would change the visual language of demons forever. In his most famous print, The Temptation of St. Anthony, the saint doesn't stand still or strike a holy pose. He hangs helpless in the air. His body suspended and twisted as a storm of demons tears at him from every side. Schongauer's demons were uncomfortably real. They had brawny, muscly arms, like fighters ready to crush him. They sprouted feathery wings that looked stolen from birds of prey. They twisted with tails, horns and claws, every inch covered in scales, spines or warty snouts. It was as if Schongauer had gone out into the fields and forests, studied lizards, fish, birds and beasts, and then stitched them together into something alive, something you almost wished wasn't real. Even the young Michelangelo was so mesmerised by the engraving that he copied it in paint, a rare sign of just how revolutionary it was. But the public? They didn't just admire it as art, they believed in it. These prints circulated so widely that people began to treat them like protective charms. Some carried them as talismans against St. Anthony's fire, a horrific disease caused by poisoned rye grain. Then came Hieronymus Bosch. Around the year 1501, he unveiled his Lisbon triptych of the Temptation of St. Anthony, and suddenly, the demons weren't just circling Anthony, they were staging an entire carnival of chaos around him. In the central panel, a blasted tree trunk twists itself into the body of a woman. Her torso is human, but her legs end in the curling scales of a lizard's tail. In her arms, she cradles a baby, a grotesque parody of motherhood as she rides across the landscape on the back of a giant rat. Elsewhere, a fish sprouts legs and marches like a soldier. Birds wear helmets and armour, parodying human war. Hybrid beasts, half human, half nightmare, crawl, stumble and slither across scorched ground. It was as if Bosch had reached into the collective unconscious of Europe and painted every buried anxiety, every forbidden image in one impossible scene. For some, Bosch had gone too far. Where Schongauer's demons still carried the weight of religious instruction, Bosch's seemed to teeter on the edge of dark comedy. One Spanish poet, Fray José de Singüesa, was forced to come to his defence. He argued that Bosch's monsters were moral warnings, not mere distractions. But even his words couldn't silence the critics. And then came the most disturbing twist of all. Between 1512 and 1516, the German painter Matthias Grunewald created his own version of the Temptation of St. Anthony. But unlike Schongauer or Bosch, Grunewald didn't paint for kings or collectors. His work was part of the Isenheim altarpiece, commissioned for a hospital run by the Antonine monks. This wasn't art meant for courtly halls or cathedral chapels. It was meant for the eyes of the suffering, plague victims, the diseased, the dying. Men and women writhing in agony of St. Anthony's fire, the same ergotism that Europe had feared for centuries. And Grunewald gave them no comfort. In his vision, the demons themselves are infected. One figure is swollen, its skin stretched and bloated, covered in oozing pustules. Another looks like its flesh is literally sloughing off the bone, its body a grotesque parody of rot. Others twist and stagger as though crippled by the same pain that racked the very patients gazing up at the altarpiece. For those who saw it, the horror was personal. These were not abstract monsters from the imagination. These were mirror images of their own suffering. Their sores, their sickness, their decay painted onto the bodies of demons. Centuries later, modern doctors would analyse Grunewald's demons like medical textbooks. Some concluded the figures showed signs of syphilis. Others argued they depicted advanced skin diseases or neurological damage. And then comes the truly eerie connection. The disease ergotism, that burning madness of St. Anthony's fire, was caused by a fungus in rye grain. It produced convulsions, gangrene, and above all, terrifying hallucinations. That same fungus would one day yield a chemical component the modern world knows as LSD, which means the patients lying in that hospital staring at Grunewald's hellish vision may have been hallucinating themselves, tripping inside their own illness, while the altarpiece reflected their visions back at them in demonic form. A feedback loop of pain, fear, and nightmare, all framed as holy art. So why did these paintings provoke such fierce reactions? Because they smashed through every boundary that medieval Europe tried to enforce. The Catholic Church demanded that religious art stay within strict limits, holy, dignified, and pure. Its purpose was to guide the faithful toward virtue, not drag their minds into the gutter. But the temptation of St. Anthony turned that formula upside down. Instead of showing holiness, these works put temptation and sin right in the spotlight. They forced audiences to stare directly at the very things the church insisted they should turn away from. Medieval churches already had gargoyles leering down from their rooftops, but those figures were distant, perched safely above. St. Anthony's visions weren't tucked into stone or hidden in shadows. They were immediate, intimate, and unavoidable. Bosch's demons practically stumbled out of the panel toward you. Grunewald's diseased monsters seemed to breathe the same air as the patients who stood before them. Perhaps most shocking of all, artists like Bosch and Grunewald blurred the line between holiness and horror. They combined beauty and disgust, humour and terror, faith and fantasy, in ways that left audiences shaken. Were you supposed to laugh at Bosch's absurd rat-riding lizard woman, or shiver in fear? Was Grunewald offering a vision of spiritual triumph, or a grotesque mirror of hopeless suffering? Religious art was supposed to offer clarity, a straight path from sin to salvation. But these paintings did the opposite. They unsettled the faithful, forcing them to confront the idea that temptation wasn't distant, abstract, or safely contained. It was everywhere. It was inside you. And that was the most dangerous message of all. The story of St. Anthony's torment didn't vanish with the Middle Ages. It morphed, adapted, and resurfaced in ways that reflected the fears of each new era. In the 1500s, Peter Bruegel the Elder took the scene in a new direction. Where Bosch had crowded his canvas with grotesque chaos, Bruegel pulled the perspective back. St. Anthony suddenly seemed tiny, a speck lost in vast landscapes. The shift was subtle but devastating. Temptation was no longer just about personal demons clawing at your soul. It was about the immensity of the world itself, the overwhelming pressure of nature, society, and forces beyond human control. Humanity, Bruegel suggested, wasn't centre stage at all. It was fragile, small, and always on the verge of being swallowed whole. Centuries later, Salvador Dali in 1946 gave the story its most surreal transformation. His vision of St. Anthony wasn't about beasts or landscapes, but about the subconscious itself. He painted elephants with impossibly spindly legs, like skeletal skyscrapers teetering through a barren desert. On their backs they carried symbols of lust, wealth, and power, the same temptations Anthony had fled from in the desert, but now reimagined through Freud, surrealism, and the atomic age. These weren't medieval demons anymore. They were modern anxieties stretched and distorted into dreamlike nightmares. Every age reinvented the demons. In the Middle Ages, they gnawed at the flesh. In the Renaissance, they towered as vast landscapes and worldly forces. By the 20th century, they had crawled inside the human psyche, transforming into symbols of desire, obsession, and fear. The temptation of St. Anthony never disappeared from art history. It became a mirror. And every generation that looked into it saw its own nightmares staring back. The temptation of St. Anthony remains one of the most unsettling subjects in Western art, not because of the saint himself, but because of the mirror it holds up to us. Each era's demons reflected its deepest fears. In medieval Europe, evil hid in disease, delirium, and the devil's tricks. The Renaissance recast it as temptation and the fragility of the human soul. The modern world twisted it into lust, greed, and desire, rendered in surreal, dreamlike forms. And that's why, even centuries later, these images still disturb us. Because no matter how the demons are painted, grotesque, comical, surreal, or symbolic, they all point back to the same truth. The hardest battle we fight is never against monsters in the shadows, but against the ones we carry within. So what do you see in St. Anthony's torment? Horror, humour, or hidden truths about human nature? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoy uncovering hidden stories in art, make sure to check out my other deep dives.